Hi everybody, welcome to the latest video in our series on the making of modern Britain, Unit 2S. Our previous videos have looked at the period of Conservative government between 1951 and 1964. This video takes up the story in 1964 through to 1970, and these are years of Labour government under Prime Minister Harold Wilson. This video is going to look a little bit at who Wilson was, why he won 2 elections, and a little bit about his character, his style of government, and his political views. We're also going to have a look at some of the economic challenges facing Wilson and his government and assess whether or not he was successful in tackling those challenges. First of all then, Wilson's victory in elections in both 1964 and also 1966. In a previous video, we talked about Alec Douglas Hume, Prime Minister from 1963 to 1964, and about the fact that by the early 60s, it seemed astonishing that the Conservatives had chosen an aristocrat, a member of the upper classes, to be their leader and to be Prime Minister. Britain was changing to some extent. There were questions being asked about the establishment, and Hume seemed a very peculiar choice. Wilson very effectively plays on that during the 1964 election. Wilson is very skilled at presenting himself as an ordinary man, a grammar school boy, somebody who is far more modern and in touch with 1960s Britain than Hume was. And part of the reason why Wilson and Labour win in 1964 is because they convince the people of Britain that Wilson is indeed a moderniser, that Hume is old-fashioned, he's out of touch, that Britain had been stagnating under the Conservatives. It's also about the sort of things that Wilson is saying too, in particular about science and technology. We know that the 50s was a time of economic and social change. We know that new technology was being developed, and Wilson taps into this. Wilson is skilled at making speeches which refer in particular to this phrase, the white heat of technological change. Wilson says the Conservatives have held Britain back. Other parts of the world, Japan, the US, West Germany, have invested in research, are leading in terms of technological development, and Britain needs to catch up. And Wilson's argument is that Labour is the party of progress, of modernity. It's Labour which will do it, and that is an appealing message. Having said all of that, it's interesting that Labour only scrape into power with a majority of 4 in 1964. That sort of majority is simply not sustainable for 5 years. So 2 years on, in 1966, while much of England is busy watching England win the World Cup, Wilson is going to the polls. And in the 1966 election, as you can see, the Labour majority increases pretty dramatically to 98. So we know why Wilson won in 64, but why does he win so handsomely in 66? And it's an interesting question, because the Conservatives have actually chosen a new leader who is very much not from the upper classes. Edward Heath is a grammar school person like Wilson himself. He can very much present himself as a pretty ordinary man too. The problem is that he, particularly on TV, which is such an important form of media by the 60s, Heath comes across as pretty boring. He's a little bit stiff and awkward. Wilson is relaxed, friendly, confident, far more skilled at using TV, and that contributes to this increased Labour majority. Heath doesn't compare to Wilson, particularly in terms of media perceptions. Let's have a little think about Wilson as a politician and some of the things he may have believed in. People have often said that Wilson was a left-winger, that he came from the left of the Labour Party itself. It's certainly true that in the 40s and the 50s, Wilson was a close ally of Aneurin Bevan and was very firmly on the left, the Bevanite left of the Labour Party, in the battle, really, for the soul of the party against Hugh Gaitskell and the centrists. So when Bevan resigns from Attlee's government, when prescription charges are introduced for the NHS for things like false teeth and glasses, Wilson resigns alongside him. Wilson is a loyal ally of Bevan. So much so that by 1961, when Gaitskell has been leader of the party for several years, Gaitskell is increasingly unpopular. It's Wilson who takes him on, unsuccessfully, but takes him on as the left-wing candidate. Having said that, we can also see elements of Wilson which are far more moderate, far more centrist rather than very left-wing. Wilson may have opposed Gaitskell, but he nevertheless served in Gaitskell's shadow cabinet. He's prepared to work with him. Wilson also supports British nuclear weapons as well, generally something which the left of the party, with its links to CND, didn't do. During Wilson's time as Prime Minister, he fails, but he certainly tries to reform the trade unions. Wilson believes that the trade unions have exceeded their power. So those policies suggest that actually maybe Wilson is a bit more of a centrist after all. Other people claim that perhaps actually Wilson really didn't believe in much at all. There are bits of left, bits of centre. Actually, maybe Wilson just believed in whatever was going to make him popular, whatever was going to make him powerful. And some people say he's simply an opportunist. He does what he feels will make him Labour leader, make him popular with Labour members and MP, and ultimately he says and he does whatever he needs to do to win the general elections, to gain power. So is Wilson simply an opportunist? Now, there's possibly something in all three of those interpretations, but what's undoubtedly true is that final one. Wilson, perhaps more than anything, is a moderniser. We've talked already about science and technology. We've talked about Wilson projecting an image of himself as an ordinary man, almost classless, beyond classes. Quite an astonishing fact there. Until Wilson, every other Prime Minister had been to private school. Wilson is the first Prime Minister from a state school. He went to Huddersfield Grammar. Wilson has at least a bit of a Yorkshire accent, and as we've said before, he's good on TV. So it's about Wilson himself, but also about Wilson's policies and his rhetoric around technology. I'd argue that there is something in each one of those interpretations. Something you need to be aware of in terms of Wilson's style and the way he governed is a slightly peculiar phrase called the kitchen cabinet. We'll talk more about some of this in our next video, but one of the features of Wilson's government is that there were a number of really powerful heavyweight politicians within it. People like Jim Callaghan, George Brown, Roy Jenkins, and that made Wilson massively insecure. People like Callaghan and Jenkins were popular politicians. They had loads of experience. Wilson was convinced that they were plotting against him, and one of them one day would try and take his place. And it made Wilson anxious and worried. And that's why Wilson, rather than spending a lot of time with his fellow cabinet members or top civil servants, Wilson actually has a team of trusted advisors. They're not politicians, they're not in the civil service, but these are the people who get to spend the most time with Wilson. The most famous name of those is Marcia Williams. Now, Marcia Williams is Wilson's secretary, his political secretary. There's also some economic advisors. There are a few MPs, generally not in the cabinet, but those are the only people who Wilson truly trusts and will really talk to in great depth. And the phrase that we use for these people is that Wilson has a kitchen cabinet. It's about just how close these people are to Wilson. They will go to Downing Street and they will sit there and no doubt they'll have a bit of a drink and a snack and possibly even sit in the kitchen. But ultimately, these are the people who Wilson wants round his house, even if his house is 10 Downing Street. These are the people who Wilson trusts. The problem with something like this is if you end up with a kitchen cabinet because you're worried about your rivals, you're going to surround yourself with people who will probably just stoke those fears even more. By only talking to these people, Wilson becomes even more suspicious of those people like Callaghan and Jenkins, it also doesn't make for particularly effective government if government ministers and cabinet members don't have all that much access to Wilson. And we can argue that some of Wilson's insecurities, perhaps even paranoia, make it far harder for him to govern effectively. For the remainder of this video, we're going to focus on what was probably the biggest issue for Wilson, however, and that's the economy. It's certainly the case that the Wilson government inherits a tricky situation from the Conservatives. It's also the case that Labour's commitment to the white heat of technological revolution was perhaps not always as sound as Wilson had suggested. So first of all, it's the fact that much as Wilson talks about technological development, not everybody in his government is either massively committed to it or at all experienced. There's a couple of almost comical examples here. We've got Jenkins. He's going to become Home Secretary and Chancellor later on, but he begins as Aviation Minister, in other words, responsible for aircraft development, for example, for aircraft technology. Now, Jenkins is quite honest. He says, look, I'm a non-scientist. He's a very clever and very cultured man, Roy Jenkins. He loves theatre, he loves music, he loves red wine. He doesn't love science. And when briefing papers are passed to him, Jenkins will often look at them and go, don't get it. So not the best person maybe to have in a very technology-focused job. Perhaps even worse, you've got Frank Cousins, who is a union leader who's brought into the cabinet as technology minister, spearheading the revolution. Frank Cousins is not really all that interested in technology, so it's not the best start. It's also a fact that if you are going to press forward with this sort of change, you've got to invest huge amounts of money in research and development. Britain really can't afford it. It can afford it to an extent, so Britain is very involved in the development of Concorde along with France, the supersonic plane, but Britain has to be picky about which projects it does get involved with, and there's no way at all that Britain can compete with the economic and technological might of the USA. But as we say, this is not just about Wilson maybe making a few poor choices or about Wilson's rhetoric and speeches being a bit overblown. This is just the grim reality that Wilson has inherited a tricky economic situation from the previous government. A quick reminder of what that situation was. We've talked about this in previous videos. We know that for a lot of the British people, their financial situation was probably better than it had been forever in the 50s. But in terms of Britain as a country, in comparison to its competitors, especially Japan and the US and West Germany, Britain was lagging behind. It was coasting while those economies flourished. We know as well that the French, that de Gaulle says no, he vetoes the British application to join the EC in 1961, and so Britain is denied the benefits that come from membership of the EC as well. As a result of all of that, British economic growth rates are pretty limited, productivity is limited as well, and something we've talked about a lot in previous videos, Britain seems to be stuck in these stop-go cycles where we have short bursts of inflation and then the government will stop the economy by raising interest rates. We then have these deflationary areas, there's the danger of unemployment going up, and the government has to make the economy go again. All of this is short-termism. There's a very reactive flavour to the policy making, and there's a real absence of any long-term economic planning. We know as well that these stop-go policies end up in balance of payments crises where the amount of money that Britain's spending on imports far exceeds the revenue coming in from exports. We've talked already about periods of high inflation, rising prices. If wages aren't keeping pace with that, then clearly a lot of ordinary people are going to suffer. One of the biggest problems of all that Wilson inherits is a government deficit of £800 million. That's a really significant number. It's not unusual for a government to have a deficit, but 800 million is a particularly difficult figure. And Wilson is clear that he's going to have to tackle this issue alongside some of those others. And there are various possible methods that Wilson can use to sort out and to improve the standing of the British economy. He could, for example, look at deflationary policies. We've talked about these before. Obviously, this would have the advantage of controlling inflation. It would mean that Labour won't go down the devaluation route, which, as we'll see in a minute, is a route with disadvantages too. But ultimately, if you're going to do deflationary policies, things like raising taxes, raising interest rates, so people have less disposable income, that's just stop-go again. It's just like the stop phase of the old stop-go policies. So Wilson says, no, we're trying to break away from this. And a deflationary economy is one in which Labour couldn't spend huge amounts on welfare or on technology. And Wilson didn't want to be in that position. So devaluation is another option. This is one of those examples where you don't need to get too deeply into the maths of it, into the economics of it, as long as you understand the basic point about devaluation. First of all, what is devaluation? Well, devaluation is where the British pound is linked to other currencies and it's linked in a fixed rate. So just before Wilson eventually does devalue the pound, and then that's going to come later, £1 is worth 2.8 US dollars. Devaluation will mean that the pound is then worth only 2.4 US dollars. Now, if you do the maths, or maybe do the math since we're talking about America, you'll find that devaluation does a couple of things. First of all, it makes exports cheaper. So if you're a British business and you do a lot of exporting, your exports are competitive, they're cheaper, people will buy more, they'll be tempted to buy them. It's good news for British export business. The other thing that devaluation does is it makes imports more expensive. So if you're a British person and you're considering importing, you might well think twice. Perhaps it's going to encourage people to buy British, it's going to protect British business, and in that sense as well, devaluation could be good for the British economy. Both of those things should help the balance of payments. So that's another option that Wilson can take, and as we'll see, he eventually does take that, but not at the beginning, because Wilson is cautious. Devaluation has economic benefits, but on a political level, it's embarrassing. You're basically saying by devaluing the pound, Britain is not a strong economy. Britain doesn't compare and doesn't compete properly with the US. It's a political humiliation, even though it has economic benefits. Attlee had to devalue the pound in 1949. Wilson is really worried that Labour will get a reputation as the party of devaluation. He doesn't want that. So that's another option that, in the first instance, doesn't happen. So what does Wilson actually do? Well, what he does is he says, do you know what? We've got to break out of stop-go. We're going to plan the economy properly in the long term. And he does that by setting up something called the DEA. This is a new department of government called the Department of Economic Affairs. And Wilson puts George Brown in charge of it. Brown is another really senior, really experienced Labour politician. And the DEA is all about planning, it's about setting targets for economic growth, and across the country there are going to be economic planning councils under the oversight of the DEA. And George Brown cracks on with this quickly. He says we need to work together with trade unionists, with business, with civil servants. We need to sit down, we need to get these voluntary agreements about prices, about wages, about keeping a lid on both of them so that we're properly planning the economy and we're keeping inflation down. So in theory, is this the moment where the British economy can finally break out of this cycle of stop-go? Well, the answer is no. Part of the reason why is because of the Treasury. Now, the Treasury is the government department which traditionally has dealt with the money. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is in charge of the Treasury. The Treasury doesn't like this upstart new government department pretty much telling it what to do. The Treasury say, well, we control economic policy, this DEA shouldn't be doing it. And on a more personal level, Jim Callaghan, hugely powerful figure as Chancellor, doesn't like the fact that George Brown appears to be a rival when it comes to making economic policy. Brown himself is something of a problem as well. He's a controversial character. He can be brilliant, but he can also be terrible. He's impulsive, he's reckless. There are all sorts of rumours about his heavy drinking. Is he an alcoholic? Brown is not the most reliable person to put in charge of such an important job, but equally he's popular in the party, he's experienced. Wilson knew he had to give him a leading role, but was this perhaps not the right role? It's also true that the civil service seems to be working against Brown. The rumours that his phone's been tapped, rumours that civil servants are not giving key government papers to George Brown. So for all those reasons, ultimately the DEA, a great idea in theory, ends up failing, partly for political reasons, partly for personal reasons. And the sign of that is that in 1966, only 2 years into the government, George Brown is moved to be Foreign Secretary, and a year later, Wilson abolishes the DEA. It's a very short-lived experiment in trying, but ultimately failing, to break out of stop-go. So the question is, well, what does Labour do next? What it does next is what we call prices and incomes policies. And this is quite simple. This is the government saying to union leaders, to employers, we've got to restrain wages. We can't have wages rising and rising all the time. We've also got to stop prices increasing all the time. And on a really simple level, this is about trying to force unions and employers into a situation where inflation comes down. And this involves setting up a board, an organisation, a group called the Prices and Incomes Board, which is going to oversee these policies to try and keep wages and prices at a sensible level. This leads to a couple of consequences that Wilson really hadn't wanted. First of all, when Wilson says to the unions, you've got to keep a lid on wages, we've got to be restrained, some of the unions are unsurprisingly not very happy about this. In particular, the Seamen's Union goes on strike for quite a period in 1966. Frank Cousins, if you remember, cabinet member who began as a trade unionist, he resigns from the cabinet. He feels that unfair pressure is being put on the unions. And the left of the Labour Party agree with Frank Cousins as well. Wilson increasingly, as we move through the 60s, is becoming an unpopular Prime Minister with the left of his own party. They feel he should be backing the unions, that he should be far more positive as a Labour Prime Minister about strike action. But when all this is said and done, where are we? We've seen Wilson reject certain economic policies like deflation and devaluation. We've seen Wilson attempt to do some long-term economic planning with the DEA, but clearly that's failed. We've seen Wilson calling for price and wage restraint, but that in many ways has only created further tension, particularly with the unions. So where do we turn next? We turn next to devaluation, and this was something, as we know, Wilson hadn't wanted to do. But as so often in politics, events get in the way. And in 1967, there's a really significant war in the Middle East between Israel and some of its Arab neighbours. And as often happens when there's a war in the Middle East, oil supplies to the West are affected there, very much reduced or even cut off. And this has an impact on the British economy. What we also get in August of 1967 is a dock strike, and clearly the docks are really important for the export trade. Exports suddenly are not being exported to any great degree, and once again we have a balance of payments crisis. And Wilson realises he's going to have to move towards devaluation for the economic reasons that we set out before. It's the fact that ultimately this is going to make exports cheaper and more competitive. Imports will become more expensive, potentially protecting British business. And the details of the devaluation, the pound is now 14% lower against the dollar, the US dollar. It's gone from £1 being $2.8 to being $2.4. Like we've said before, despite the economic benefits, devaluation is politically humiliating. And alongside this, Labour does something else that it hadn't wanted to do originally, which is deflation, increasing interest rates, putting restrictions on credit and on hire purchase. So all of this is going to be unpopular. Deflationary policies limiting the amount of disposable income and credit that people have generally don't go down well. And it's the fact that Labour said we're not going to do deflation, we're going to break out of stop go, we're going to never ever do devaluation again, and now Labour's doing all of these things. Labour doesn't seem particularly credible anymore. People stop believing Wilson on the economy. It goes from bad to worse in 1967. Wilson applies to join the EEC, and for the second time, that is rejected. For the second time, Britain can't enjoy the benefits of EEC membership. It's not all bad news. Roy Jenkins, we mentioned him earlier, becomes Chancellor later on in the Wilson government, and he continues to pursue deflation, and that does lead to a balance of payments surplus. The revenue from exports increases spending on imports. Having said that, inflation right at the end of the Wilson period in 69-70 is at 12%. That really is pretty high. So the overall story of Wilson and the economy is one of struggle, one of great ambitions around breaking out of stop go, about the white heat of technological change. The reality is that the economy lurches from one crisis to another under Wilson, and that aim of long-term planning really never comes to fruition.
Huge thank you again to Tom for that. A really brilliant video on a bit more modern British history. Again, this is part of our series on modern Britain, going through the 2S syllabus on AQA, taking us through from 1951 through to 2007. We will continue to add more and more videos to this, so if you haven't done so already, please subscribe, turn on notifications, so as more videos get added, and there should be some more coming very, very soon, then you can keep up to date with all of those, and it should help you develop your knowledge and get ready for those lovely exams. We will also be adding videos on all other types of topics, so there are other history topics. There's also lots of stuff on A-level politics as well, so well worth subscribing for more of me and of course some more of Tom as well. Thank you again to Tom. Thank you again to all of you for watching.